Alright class, today we're going to look at the introduction to ecosystems and populations, and all I want you to do is just make sure you listen, try to understand, and take some notes. This is focused on section 2.1. So first, we said that this entire unit is all about ecology, and ecology is the study of living things and how they interact with one another as well as their environment. So if we look, this as the abiotic environment specifically. So it's organisms, how they interact with other living things, and then how they interact with non-living or abiotic things in the environment. So we can study life at a bunch of different levels. So if you study biochemistry, you would just be studying chemicals, the molecules and atoms within living organisms. You can study cellular biology. You could study tissues or organs. You can study body systems. And then you can study at larger scales. So we're looking at things at an organismal scale. So looking at the whole organism, we're looking at populations or groups of individuals within the same species that interact with one another. And later we'll be looking at entire landscapes within the biosphere, as well as communities in ecosystems. So a community would be groups of different species of organisms and how they interact with one another. Well, here's a bunch of terms. A lot of these we should already have in our notes, so I wouldn't worry if you're not sure about them. I'm sure you have them somewhere in your notes. So species we talked about to quite a great extent, actually. So we said a species is a group of organisms that are highly related, that are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, and generally speaking, they share a lot of DNA as well. So a population, like we said, organisms within the same species that live in the same area and could potentially interact with one another or reproduce together. A community then is populations of different species. So when we did that competition activity with the M&Ms, we were actually different species, so that was a more community-based activity. And then the ecosystem is the interaction between the abiotic and biotic factors. So if we look, we're looking at the Bracciano Lake where Zinzi lives and all the different abiotic and biotic factors that you might find there. The biosphere, so if this term is not familiar to you, the biosphere refers to the zone on Earth where organisms live. So that would be, if we're thinking about all organisms, all places where we can find life, there is a zone of the atmosphere, there's a zone of the hydrosphere and the water, and there's a zone of the lithosphere, the earth and soil, in which we can find living things and living materials. So that area where all living things, or where living things can exist, is considered the biosphere. Okay, so that's the living sphere of the world. Then we've already talked quickly about biotic and abiotic factors, but here they are again. So abiotic means not living, so the A prefix means not. So abiotic is not living factors in the environment. So this includes anything that is not alive and never has been part of a living organism. So if we look, we could consider light, temperature, rain, wind, all of those things are non-living. Rock is non-living. And then there's a biotic factor. So biotic factors are everything that is alive or was part of something that was alive. So if we're talking about biotic factors being the organisms themselves, how they interact with each other. So remember when we did that simulation, there was, I think, a parasite, there was competition, you maybe even saw mutualism as well, but other things are considered biotic too. So feces or poop is considered biotic because it came out of a living thing. So something to consider. All right, so now we're going to take a deeper look at Bracciano Lake. We could say that Bracciano Lake is a specific habitat. So it's a specific location. We could pinpoint it on a map, okay, and organisms could live there. In fact, certain organisms are contained there because they can't just get up and walk away from that lake. So it's its own little environment. Then we looked at a niche. So a niche is the specific role of an organism, so based on everything that organism uses and the waste produced by that specific organism. So if we look at Bracciano Lake, we could consider one of the niches to be the shallow margins of the lake. So maybe within this lake, there are certain organisms that can only live in the shallow edges of the lake because they have specific conditions. So they might have a specific amount of light or oxygen available or nutrient levels, and that's where those organisms survive. So that's where they get their food, that's where they interact with the abiotic environment as well. So the last few days we've been looking at population growth. So remember, population growth just refers to the change in size of a population over time, whether it's getting bigger or smaller. And then we kind of jokingly looked at this, how can we reduce the rat population in Rome? So to think about some factors that might control or limit the population growth. Okay. So if a population is a group of interbreeding organisms, so the rat populations are able to encounter one another, they interact, they could potentially interbreed, they use the same resources here, so they have the same sources of food, water, shelter, mates, etc. We know that if we want to increase the population, generally speaking, we would provide them with more resources. So if we put out more food for the rats, then we'd expect that their population would grow. On the other hand, if we reduce the resources for the rats, then their population would likely decrease. So one of the things that people suggested we do was to kind of clean up the trash, or make sure that the trash is not actually on the street, but in the bins where it's enclosed, so it can't be accessed by the rats, and that might decrease their population size. So populations can also change in response to environmental stresses. So I'm just going to bring all these up here. So changes that can occur to a population can refer to just the general size of the number of the population, or the number of individuals in the population, as well as the density, so how many organisms exist within a space. Populations can change based on age distribution, so how many of the people within a population are older versus younger. And dispersion, so dispersion refers to the spacing of the organism, and that's what these images are. So organisms can be clumped, so that means they exist together in pods or groups. They could be uniform, so evenly spaced. This is rather uncommon for animals. And they could also be kind of randomly placed, so as if you just grabbed a handful of seeds and then just threw them out in the yard and just waited to see where the flowers would grow. So just kind of random dispersion. Next chunk of information we saw in the POGL. So we saw that when populations don't have limitations on their growth, and they tend to grow exponentially. So exponential growth has this like lag phase where they're colonizing an area, and then after that we see this huge increase in population growth. And this we refer to as a J population growth, or J-shaped population curve. If you look at the POGL, it doesn't focus on this, but this is the term, this J-shaped curve, is how it's referred to within the IB textbook and the IB guide, so just make sure you're familiar with that. So we kind of joked that this isn't really like a J, but it's kind of simple. If you were making a letter, you start at the top and you curve toward the left. So we're saying that's most similar to a J, and that's why it's named that way. So we see this exponential increase in an organism's growth. So an example of this would be bacteria, and there was a calculation problem in the POGL, but don't worry if you didn't get it right. So let's say we start out with a population of 8 bacteria within a solution with lots of resources. We've got all the food and everything that the bacteria need within this solution. So after 24 hours, we could have 10 to the 24th power bacteria. So that's trillions of bacteria growing within the test tube, which is pretty disgusting, but also pretty amazing, because that's a heck of a lot of bacteria that could grow there. Again, really super fast as well. Now, what else grows like this? So if we look at this growth curve, so this is the human population growth curve, you can see that our population growth is following this same shape. So it's increasing exponentially if we look at modern day specifically. So it has increased, wildly throughout the past, even 500 years. It's been a huge, huge, huge change in the human population. Then we see there's some reason for that. So we had some really simple advancements in technology and culture in the beginning, and then we had an increase in agricultural advances, and then finally, we had this industrial age. We had machines and the burning of fossil fuels, and we had modern medicine, and now our population is booming. I actually looked for this one, and the reason I like this one is because it does show that there's a dip in the population when the bubonic plague hit Europe. So I just find that kind of interesting. So that actually had a huge impact on the human population at the time, so that bubonic or black plague. Okay? But you can see, nonetheless, we're still continuing this exponential growth today. So the question is, can this continue forever? And that's the type of growth that our population is showing. So can we continue this J-shaped growth curve forever? And as far as we know, it's not possible. So there's a limited number of resources on Earth. Only a certain number of organisms can survive. So we see that there is a carrying capacity. So that's the total, or the maximum number that can survive in that area without causing any damage to the environment, which might be followed by dieback. So if you look, this is okay. So the blue is kind of the simplified version of the graph. So this is what we normally see. So that's the simplified population growth of this sheep. But if we actually looked at the numbers of the sheep, we would likely see what's in pink. So we can see that J-shaped growth. Then we see here's some overshoots. So overshoot means the population here got to be too big, so it was no longer able to sustain that number of individuals. Then we saw is followed by some dieback. So maybe a lot of organisms were born because everyone was doing fine. They had a lot of babies, and then they weren't able to feed the babies. Okay. So after these areas of overshoot, we then can see dieback. So we see here that a lot of the organisms died. So in this situation that I'm creating, maybe a lot of the organisms then starved. Right? And then we see it goes back up again and kind of fluctuates around that carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is more an average over an extended period of time, even though the population itself will fluctuate. So we're not going to expect to have a specific number of organisms for an extended period of time. So what could impact carrying capacity? So we know that competition within and between organisms and different species impacts the number of organisms that can survive in the population. Natural and human caused disasters, so catastrophe is just a disaster. So similar to what you would see when we did the fish activity in that simulation online. So there could be a disaster occurred, or a weather event, or a disease hit, and those things impact the population. So immigration, emigration, naturally occurring disasters as well. All of these things impact the carrying capacity and how many organisms can live there. So this type of curve we call logistic growth curve, but again, the IB refers to it as an S or S-shaped curve, population curve. So the S stands for sigmoid, and it really is called that because it's supposed to resemble an S. So if you made a shape like this, okay, so tracing it, it's supposed to be similar to an S. So we just call it an S-shaped growth curve. So here again, if we cut it off, essentially, so if we cut it off, right, before it flattened out, we would have that J-shaped curve. Okay, so if we cut off the graph right down the middle, that would be the J-shaped curve. So we still have this lag phase, then we have the exponential growth, but then we see it flatten out, okay, to the carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is represented with the letter K. So just zooming into this again. So that exponential growth phase is there, that transitional or lag phase when the organisms are getting established is there, and then there's a plateau when they hit their limits. Okay, so when the population starts hitting those limits from the environment. So then this is kind of a silly one, but it's just this reindeer, and the question is, well, what happened here? So we see this really interesting shape. So actually, I mean, it does look like that J-shaped curve. And then we see this extreme drop-off. So the population grows. It almost looks like it's a little bit over right around 2000 and then falls off drastically after that. So I just wanted you to think, why did this happen? Did we think that maybe, some event could have occurred here? Do we think that this was just natural overshoot and the carrying capacity is quite low? Or what could possibly have happened here to create this curve? So it's just kind of up to you right